The hum of the refrigerator and the soft flicker of the kitchen light were the only companions Claire had most evenings. At 53, her days had become a predictable rhythm, mornings spent tending to her small garden, afternoons filled with errands, and nights passed with a book or an old movie playing in the background. It wasn't a bad life, but it wasn't a full one either. Since her divorce nearly a decade ago, Claire had grown accustomed to solitude. Her children were grown and scattered, living lives too busy for frequent visits. And though she had a handful of friends, they seemed to orbit in their own worlds, only occasionally intersecting with hers. Her weeks were punctuated by a ritual trip to the local grocery store every Wednesday afternoon. It was a small place, tucked into the corner of the neighborhood plaza, where the employees knew her name and the aisles were familiar like an old friend. It was during one of these routine visits that something extraordinary happened. Claire was in the produce section, carefully inspecting a batch of apples, when she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, do you know if these are good for baking?" She turned and saw a man, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s, holding up a bag of Granny Smith apples. He had an easy smile, his dark hair slightly tousled, and his eyes, a rich, warm brown, held a curiosity that caught her off guard. "Oh, yes," she replied, feeling the words stumble awkwardly out of her mouth. "They're perfect for pies. They hold their shape well, and aren't overly sweet." "Thanks," he said, his grin widening. "I'm attempting my mom's apple pie recipe."
First time.
"Wish me luck." Claire chuckled despite herself. "Good luck, then. I'm sure it'll turn out great." Their exchange could have ended there, but something about him lingered. As she moved to the next aisle, she noticed him again, debating between two brands of vanilla extract. And again, at the bread section, where he playfully bemoaned the overwhelming variety of sourdough. By the time they both ended up in the checkout line, it felt almost natural to strike up another conversation. "Are you always this indecisive, or is it just a baking thing?" she teased, surprised at her own boldness. He laughed, a warm, genuine sound that made her feel oddly light. "It's definitely a baking thing. I'm Matt, by the way." "Claire," she replied, feeling the faintest blush rise to her cheeks. It wasn't much, a few exchanged pleasantries and a shared laugh, but as Claire drove home that afternoon, her mind kept returning to him. There was a brightness to Matt, an energy that felt like a spark in the otherwise steady monotony of her days. She told herself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of human connection in an ordinary place. And yet, as she unpacked her groceries, she couldn't help but smile, the encounter replaying in her mind like a favorite scene in a movie. For the first time in years, the predictable rhythm of her life felt as though it had missed a beat, and she wasn't sure she wanted it to go back to normal. Claire hadn't expected to see Matt again, but life has a way of surprising us when we least anticipate it. The following week, as she made her usual Wednesday trip to the grocery store, there he was, standing by the spice rack, scrutinizing a jar of cinnamon as if it held the answers to life's mysteries. "Still baking?" she asked, unable to stop herself from walking over. He turned, his face lighting up in recognition. "Claire."
Hey.
Yeah, the pie was a disaster. Too much cinnamon, I think. Or maybe it was the crust. Anyway, I'm giving it another shot. "Redemption pie." She laughed, shaking her head. "You're persistent. That's a good trait for a baker." Their conversation flowed effortlessly, and by the time Claire finished her shopping, she realized they had spent nearly 20 minutes chatting in the spice aisle. She learned that Matt was a graphic designer who had recently moved to the area to take care of his mother after a surgery. He was kind and funny, with a self-deprecating wit that kept her smiling. That day, their goodbye lingered. Claire walked to her car with a sense of lightness, her usual midweek errands now tinged with something new, anticipation. Over the next few weeks, their encounters became more frequent. Sometimes they bumped into each other at the grocery store. Other times they met by chance at the nearby coffee shop. Each meeting felt serendipitous, as though the universe were nudging them together. They began to share more about themselves. Claire found herself opening up about her divorce, her children, and her love of gardening. In turn, Matt told her about his struggles balancing work and caregiving, his dreams of traveling the world, and his attempts to master his mother's recipes. One afternoon, as they sat at a small table outside the coffee shop, Matt leaned back in his chair, the sun casting a warm glow on his face. "You know," he said, "I'm glad we keep running into each other. You make this town feel less, I don't know, lonely." His words caught her off guard, and for a moment, she couldn't respond. How long had it been since someone had said something so kind to her? "You make it feel a little less lonely for me, too," she admitted softly. As the weeks turned into months, their bond deepened. They began exchanging texts, simple things at first, like sharing photos of their baking attempts or joking about their grocery store escapades. But soon, their conversations grew longer and more personal, spilling into late-night chats about everything from favorite books to the dreams they'd shelved for years. Claire found herself looking forward to his messages, her phone lighting up with his name, becoming a source of quiet joy. She hadn't felt this alive, this connected in years. And yet, beneath the surface of her happiness, a quiet unease began to stir, a feeling she couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. Claire was watering her garden on a crisp Saturday morning when it struck her. She was thinking about Matt. Not just a passing thought, but a lingering one, a warmth that settled in her chest as she recalled his crooked smile and the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. She paused, her watering can hovering above the petunias. What was she doing? Was she really letting herself feel this way about a man nearly half her age? The realization hit her with the force of an unexpected wave. Over the months, her friendship with Matt had become the brightest part of her life. She had grown to cherish their talks, his laughter, the way he listened so intently, as if her words were the most important thing he'd hear that day. But now it was different. She wasn't just happy when she saw him. She felt giddy, her heart racing in ways it hadn't since she was much younger. She sat down on the garden bench, wiping her hands on her jeans. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself. She was a grown woman, a mother of 2 grown children, no less. Matt deserved someone his own age, someone who could share his youthful energy and dreams for the future. Still, the feelings refused to be pushed away. Every time she tried to convince herself it was just a passing crush, his face would flash in her mind. The way he looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and admiration, the easy charm that made her feel like the best version of herself. The next time they met for coffee, Claire was acutely aware of her emotions. She couldn't help noticing the way his fingers brushed hers when he handed her a napkin, or how his laughter seemed to linger in the air long after it faded. "You've been quiet today," Matt said, leaning forward with a concerned look. "Everything okay?" Claire hesitated, the words caught in her throat. "I'm fine," she said finally, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." He didn't press her, but his gaze lingered, as if he could see right through her. Later that evening, as she sat in her dimly lit living room, Claire let herself feel the full weight of her emotions. She was falling for him. There was no denying it now. Her heart soared at the thought of him, but it also ached with the fear of what this could mean. Would he ever see her the way she saw him? And even if he did, what would people think? She curled up on the couch, her mind racing. The idea of pursuing these feelings felt both thrilling and terrifying, a precarious balance between hope and doubt. But as she stared out the window at the moonlit garden, one thing became clear. These feelings, however unexpected, were real. And she couldn't ignore them any longer. The days following Claire's realization were a whirlwind of emotions, each one pulling her in a different direction. She would wake up feeling a giddy sense of excitement, her heart fluttering at the thought of seeing Matt. By afternoon, doubt would creep in, whispering all the reasons why this could never work. She spent hours analyzing every interaction, questioning whether she'd misread his kindness as something more. Maybe he was just naturally warm and attentive. But then she'd remember the way he looked at her, how his words seemed to carry a weight that went beyond friendship. One evening, Claire found herself sitting on her bed, her journal open in front of her. Writing had always been her way of making sense of her emotions, and tonight, the pen felt heavy in her hand. "Why him? Why now?" she wrote. "I've spent years building walls, convincing myself that my time for this kind of love had passed. And yet, here he is, this impossible, beautiful possibility I never saw coming. The societal expectations weighed heavily on her mind. What would her friends say if they knew? Her children? She could already imagine the judgmental glances, the whispered comments. The next time she met Matt, these fears clung to her like a shadow. They were walking through the park, the crisp autumn air filling the space between them. He was talking about a trip he wanted to take, his face alight with enthusiasm. "You should come with me," he said suddenly, turning to her. Claire stopped walking, her breath catching in her throat.
What?
"Come with me," he repeated, his tone earnest. "You've always said you want to see more of the world. Why not start now?" She laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Matt, I'm not exactly the spontaneous type. And besides, I'm older," he finished, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you were going to say?" Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away. "It's the truth, isn't it?" He stepped in front of her, gently placing a hand on her arm. "Claire, you're one of the most vibrant, interesting people I've ever met. I don't care about your age. I care about you." The sincerity in his voice shook something loose inside her, and for a moment, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be real. But later that night, the doubts returned with a vengeance. What if he didn't fully understand what he was getting into? What if this was just a fleeting infatuation for him? Claire found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her fingers tracing the fine lines around her eyes. "What are you doing?" she whispered to herself. "You're setting yourself up for heartbreak." And yet, as much as she tried to push him away in her mind, her heart refused to let go. Every time she thought about walking away, the thought of losing him felt unbearable. The turmoil was exhausting, but it was also a reminder of something she hadn't felt in years: the messy, wonderful chaos of being alive. And deep down, she knew she couldn't turn back now. Claire stood in the middle of her kitchen, staring at the countertop as if it held the answers to the questions swirling in her mind. The room, usually a comforting haven, now felt stifling as she contemplated her next move. Inviting him over. It sounded so simple, and yet the thought filled her with both anticipation and dread. What if it changed everything? What if it didn't? She ran her fingers over the edge of her phone, Matt's number glowing on the screen. He had texted her earlier, asking if she had plans for the weekend. A simple question, one that carried the potential to shift the dynamic between them. Her first instinct had been to deflect, to keep things as they were. But as the day wore on, an idea had taken root. Invite him over for dinner. It was casual enough to not feel like a declaration, but intimate enough to create a space for something deeper to unfold. Still, the fear lingered. Claire paced the kitchen, glancing at the clock. The seconds felt loud, each tick pushing her closer to a decision. Finally, she inhaled deeply and typed out the message. "Would you like to come over for dinner Saturday night? I make a decent lasagna." She hovered over the send button, her thumb trembling. Then, with a quick flick, the message was gone, leaving her breathless. Moments later, her phone buzzed. She nearly dropped it in her haste to read his reply. "I'd love that. What time should I come by?" A rush of warmth spread through her, followed by a wave of nerves. She quickly typed back, "6:30 works.
See you then."
The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation and second-guessing. She found herself scrutinizing every detail, the lighting, the table setting, even the music playlist. She wanted the evening to feel effortless, though her own heart was anything but calm. Saturday arrived, and as the clock inched closer to 6:30, Claire felt the weight of her decision settle in. She stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the skirt of her navy dress. It was simple, understated, but she couldn't help fussing over how it fit. The doorbell rang, and her heart leapt. She opened the door to find Matt standing there with a bottle of wine and his familiar, easy smile. "I hope this pairs well with lasagna," he said, holding it up. Claire laughed softly, stepping aside to let him in. "It'll do just fine." As they settled into the evening, the initial tension began to melt away. Conversation flowed easily, the warmth of the meal mirrored in their shared laughter. But beneath the surface, Claire felt the weight of what this evening represented. A step forward, a risk she hadn't taken in years. When the meal was over and the remnants of dessert sat forgotten on the table, Matt leaned back in his chair and looked at her. "You've outdone yourself," he said. "This has been perfect." Claire smiled, her heart racing as she met his gaze. "I'm glad you're here," she said softly. And for the first time in years, she felt that maybe she wasn't so alone after all. The evening unfolded in a soft, comfortable rhythm. After dinner, they moved to the small sitting area by the window, the dim light casting a golden hue over the space. Outside, the world felt distant, the streetlights flickering in the cool night air. Inside, it was just the two of them, talking about the mundane, the profound, and everything in between. Matt's laugh had become a balm to Claire's soul. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners, how he didn't hesitate to laugh at her jokes, even the ones she wasn't sure were funny. And his kindness, so effortless, so genuine, that she felt it in every word, every gesture. She noticed little things, like how his hand brushed against hers when he passed her a glass of wine, how his gaze lingered just a fraction longer than usual. It wasn't that she hadn't noticed men before,
But there was something different about Matt.
something that felt both like a revelation and an impossible dream. As the evening wore on, the conversation slowed, and a quiet settled between them. The moments that once felt uncertain now felt natural, the air thick with unsaid words. Finally, Matt shifted in his seat, his gaze holding hers with an intensity she hadn't expected. He leaned forward slightly, as though drawn by an invisible thread, and Claire's pulse quickened. "I've been thinking about this all night," he said, his voice low, as though he were carefully choosing each word. She could barely breathe, the weight of the moment settling heavily in her chest. Her heart raced as she silently willed herself not to overthink. "About what?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a little nervous, but his eyes never wavered. "About how easy this is. How comfortable it feels to be with you. I wasn't sure what to expect tonight, but now I'm just glad it's happening." Claire's breath caught in her throat. There it was, the unspoken truth she had been afraid to acknowledge for so long. It was the same truth she'd tried to bury, the one that made her question everything, from their age difference to the inevitable judgment that might come from people who wouldn't understand. "You know," she began, the words tumbling out in a rush, "I never thought I'd be in this place. Never thought I'd be sitting here, with you, feeling," she faltered, unsure of how to continue. "Feeling what?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Feeling this." She gestured between them. "This connection. This possibility. It's been so long since I've allowed myself to feel like this, to feel anything at all." There it was, the truth that had been simmering beneath her skin for weeks. She was afraid. Afraid of what it meant, of the consequences, of the distance between them in terms of experience, and most of all, afraid of how much it mattered. Matt's hand reached out, his fingers brushing her own again, a touch that held everything unsaid. "I don't care about what people think, Claire. I just know that I want to be here, with you." Her chest tightened, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the weight of time, of her age, of all the things that had once kept her bound in place. All she felt was the gentle, steady beat of her heart, and the warmth of Matt's hand in hers. For the first time, the uncertainty didn't scare her. The connection, the bond, whatever this was, felt real and right. And in that moment, she let herself feel it fully. No words were needed. They both knew what had shifted between them. It was a quiet understanding, a moment that held the promise of something deeper. Claire took a deep breath, her hand steady in his. And in that silence, their worlds collided, not with a crash, but with a slow, delicate exhale of relief. The days that followed felt different. Lighter somehow, though the world outside remained unchanged. Claire went through her usual routines, grocery store trips, afternoon walks, evenings spent with a book, but there was a subtle shift. In every action, in every thought, she carried him with her. Matt's laughter, His touch, his words, they lingered in the corners of her mind like a soft melody, coaxing her out of the quiet prison she had built for herself. She found herself reflecting on the years that had passed, on the love she had once known, the love that had slipped away with time. Her marriage, the one that had once held the promise of forever, had faded quietly into the background of her life. She had been content to let it go, knowing that there would never be a time in her life where she would go searching for love again.
Until now.
Now, her thoughts weren't quiet anymore. They were filled with him. Matt was different from what she had imagined for herself at this stage in her life. She had always envisioned peace, a quiet acceptance of the passage of time. But now, she was startled to realize there was still so much fire left in her. So much yearning. But with this new fire came a deep, unnerving uncertainty. She was older than him. Much older. Did it matter? Was she too old to start something like this? She caught herself thinking of the things people might say, the whispers behind her back. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how little that really mattered. It wasn't about their age difference. It was about what they shared, what they had discovered in each other. Matt made her feel alive, not as a woman defined by her years, but as a person who still had so much to offer. The thought of him no longer terrified her. It was the opposite. It filled her with anticipation. She found herself wondering if perhaps it wasn't age that defined love, but the connection between two people, regardless of when they met or what the world expected of them. She thought of the way he looked at her, not with pity or judgment, but with admiration, with a deep affection that made her question everything she had believed about aging. Could love really come at any age? Could it still ignite that spark of joy, of passion? Could she, at 53, still experience something like this? For a long time, she had believed that her chance at a profound, passionate love was behind her, that somehow age had taken that from her. But now, with Matt, she was beginning to see that love didn't have an expiration date. It didn't follow a script written by society or her own fears. It just existed when two people allowed it to. And in that moment, Claire realized how much she had been holding herself back. From everything, from her own desires, from the possibilities of connection. She had spent years in a place of quiet acceptance, but it had been so much more about resignation than contentment. Now, everything had changed. As she looked out of her window, the sunset bathing the world in soft pinks and oranges, Claire realized that what she had once thought of as an obstacle, her age, wasn't an obstacle at all. It was part of the beauty of who she was. And for the first time in a long time, she was proud of it. Proud of the years that had shaped her, of the woman she had become. And most importantly, she was proud to be open to the possibility of more. More love, more connection, more joy. Because the love she was feeling now with Matt was no less real than any love she had experienced before. It was just as vibrant, just as passionate, just as deserving. And in the quiet moments of reflection, she knew that she was ready to embrace it without fear. Claire stood at her window, gazing out at the street below, her heart full and her mind clear. The day was ending, the sky deepening into twilight, and she was no longer the woman she had been. Not entirely, anyway. She had spent so many years believing that love was a chapter already written in the book of her life. That there was a certain age when it faded, when it no longer had the same intensity, the same fire. But now, standing on the precipice of something new, she understood that love could never be neatly categorized. It wasn't about age. It wasn't about time or the rules others set for her. It was about the connection between two people, the unexpected moments that brought them together. It was about what they made of the time they had, not how much time they had. The last few weeks had changed everything. Matt had brought light into her life, not because he was young or different, but because he saw her, truly saw her. And in return, she had begun to see herself differently, too. Not as a woman defined by the years that had passed, but as someone with a heart that was still capable of love, still open to connection. Her phone buzzed in her hand, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Matt. "I'm thinking about you. I'll see you soon." A smile crept onto her face. She typed a quick response. I'm looking forward to it. For so long, she had been afraid to take risks, to reach out beyond what was comfortable. But now, she had taken that first step, and it felt like freedom. It felt like the beginning of something wonderful. What they had was real. And she had no intention of hiding it, no matter what others might say. She had learned that love wasn't something to be feared, even if it defied expectations. It wasn't something that could be measured by age or time or what society dictated. It was something that came in unexpected forms, at unexpected moments, and when it did, it was to be embraced with all the heart could give. Claire had found a new chapter, and as she closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of her decision, she realized that love, true, pure love, could come at any stage in life. It wasn't about waiting for the perfect time. It was about making the time perfect. She had done that, and the journey ahead, wherever it led, felt full of promise.